Hi all, welcome back. Today we're going to have a short video on a classic of contemporary philosophy, Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality. You may have noticed when reading this that some of these themes we've covered a little bit in the chapter on utilitarianism in the text. So this short piece goes a little bit more in-depth on the topic of charitable giving, or what's normally considered charitable giving. So it will serve a function of being a nice refresher of some of these themes, and hopefully fairly easy content since it is much by way of review. And also the example paper for the class essay is going to be on the topic. The target argument will be this essay. So when I'm going through the example essay and it's referring to the arguments in this one, it will help to have read this essay and discussed it a little bit. So the author of the piece today, Peter Singer, here looking very dreamy, contemporary philosopher, amongst the most famous, I believe currently working at Princeton. I could be wrong about that. Still alive, very controversial outside of philosophical circles, inside philosophical circles, well respected. And this paper, I should note, has started a little bit of a movement. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. But Singer's argument in this paper is really simple and straightforward. And then he presents an argument, he considers a thought experiment to support one of the premises, and has I'll present another argument here about how much we should be giving, and then he considers some objections. And that's all we'll be doing, just a very short video on this topic. So let's take a look at his argument. So three premises leading to a conclusion. His conclusion is that we have a moral obligation to give money to causes such as famine relief. And note that word obligation. So normally we think of giving to causes such as famine relief, charitable donations, meaning that it's good to give, but you're not to be blamed if you don't give. Singer, on the other hand, argues for this thesis that it's obligation, not charity, to give to causes which prevent people from dying of hunger. And his argument for this conclusion is fairly straightforward, with premises that seem very uncontroversial. So let me note that this is a good example of a philosophical argument, one in which the conclusion is controversial, but the premises all seem very straightforward and uncontroversial and seem to lead to this controversial conclusion. So let's see how he builds his case. So the first premise is suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. Those are bad things. I don't know if I have to talk about this a lot. It seems like if there were things that we consider bad in the world, these would be among the least controversially bad things in the world. Suffering and dying, not having enough food, not having a place to live, or not having adequate medical care. Those are all bad ways to go and bad things to suffer. So his second premise, probably the most controversial in this argument, his second premise is, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without, through preventing it, sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And for this premise, Singer provides a thought experiment, a famous thought experiment to support it. So he has us consider a case where, imagine we were walking past a shallow, muddy pond, and while we were walking past this shallow, muddy pond, we were wearing fancy, say, $100 shoes. And we're walking by the shallow, muddy pond, and in the pond we see a child face down in the pond, struggling to save themselves, but unable to do so. And Singer asks us if we would be morally obligated to prevent the child's death. And in order to do that, we would have to wade into the muddy pond, pull out the child, and it would be at the cost of our expensive shoes. So first, ask yourself that question. If you were walking past a muddy pond and you saw a child who was drowning, do you think that you would be morally obligated to save the child? In other words, you should save the child, and if you didn't save the child, you would be an appropriate target of blame. So first, ask yourself if you agree with if you agree with what he thinks that we'll say about that thought experiment. So what he thinks we'll say is clearly, yes, we are morally obligated to save that child drowning in the pond. And we would be to blame if we didn't. I mean, if you are feeling like you don't want people putting obligations on you, then maybe you could think of the thought experiment this way. Imagine you saw this situation happen and somebody else decided to just walk by the pond, and then you confronted them and said, hey, why didn't you save that child? That child's dead in the pond now. Why didn't you just wade into the pond to save him? It's a really shallow pond. Imagine the person said to you, well, I have these expensive shoes on, and I know I didn't have time to take off my shoes, so I would have just had to go into the pond to save the child. So it was either the child or my shoes, and to be honest, the child is not worth $100. My shoes are worth more than the child. That would seem crazy, right? And we would think that person should be blamed for not helping the child. We would think there was something really wrong with them. We might wonder if they're like a sociopath or a psychopath or something, right? So Singer offers this thought experiment to support this. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening, so the child drowning, without thereby sacrificing something of comparable moral significance. So what Singer's asking us to do here is compare the moral importance of the child's life versus the $100 shoes. And he says if we can, it's clear that the child's life has more moral importance. So he concludes that if it's in our power to prevent that thing from happening without sacrificing something of comparable moral significance, and the shoes are not of comparable moral significance to the life, then we ought morally to do it. If we thought that we should, in the case of the thought experiment, that makes this premise, gives this premise some support. So then the third premise is, it is in our power to prevent suffering and death by giving money to causes such as famine relief. Now, you might be thinking, maybe here is where I can pose an objection to Singer's argument. Maybe it's not currently in your power. Maybe you're in a situation where every dollar that you make is either promised to somebody, like you're paying off debts, or is just used to keep yourself above subsistence level. So to which, if that's the case, I think Singer would say, oh yeah, this argument doesn't apply to you. But if you're ever in a situation where you have some discretionary wealth, then now this argument would apply. But you might also be thinking, maybe it's difficult to get money to the people who need it because there have been very public cases where charities have used money in ways that donors certainly would not approve of. So there's been corruption with various charities. And sometimes, even when charities are not corrupt, even with their best intentions, the money doesn't get to their target. So, for example, if you donate to people in war-torn countries, sometimes the money doesn't reach the target because the warring factions control how whether the donations get to their target or not, and sometimes they're intercepted by these warring factions and used for things like additional arms to fight their battles. That can sometimes happen. So you might have a generally skeptical attitude towards the effectiveness of charitable giving. But there's something you can do about this, and something which makes this premise relatively uncontroversial. Oops, not .com, I wanted .org. There are websites which evaluate the effectiveness of charities. My favorite website for this is GiveWell.org. GiveWell.org evaluates the top charities in terms of suffering prevented per dollar spent. As you'll note, thousands of hours of research go into finding the top-rated charities. They're evidence-backed, thoroughly vetted, and underfunded, so they could use the additional dollars. And you see that they list their top charities. So Malaria Consortium, Evidence Actions, Deworm the World Initiative, Helen Keller Initiative, Against Malaria. All of these charities per dollar spent prevent a tremendous amount of suffering to people who don't have control over their situation. So to oftentimes to children who are born into unfortunate circumstances. So these children don't have the opportunity to prevent their suffering. We have if you have any discretionary money, you have the opportunity to prevent that suffering. And if premise 2 and premise 1 are also correct, which it seems that they are, the conclusion follows. We have a moral obligation to give money to causes such as famine relief or Against Malaria foundations or that Deworm the World initiative, to causes like this where there are people suffering through no fault of their own just because they were born into very unfortunate situations that cause them suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. So, his premises, again, relatively uncontroversial. His conclusion, incredibly controversial. This is a good philosophical argument. If his premises are true, they certainly do lead to the conclusion, or at least we ought to do something. We're morally obligated to do something about the suffering. But now we might wonder, how much are we obligated to give? So, Singer's argument would go something like this. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. That was the second premise in the first argument. The second premise here is our interests and those of our dependents matter only to the degree that they're of comparable moral significance or moral importance. So we have to weigh how much benefit our wealth might do for us and for our dependents versus the tragedies that we might be preventing if we donate to causes like he suggests. So interests such as expensive cars, clothes, shoes, eating out, going to movies, concerts, sporting events are clearly not of comparable moral importance compared to the plight of desperately suffering people. That seems uncontroversial. It would be a very callous person who would say going to this movie means as much to me as food would to a child who's starving to death. So Singer concludes we're obligated to give to the point of marginal utility. Marginal utility is a technical term here. What it means is we're obligated to give to the point where if we gave any more, then we would be worse off than the people we're giving to. if what we need to do is compare the moral significance of ways our wealth could help ourselves or ways, situations it could save others from, then we would be obligated to give right down to the point where if we gave any more, we'd be worse off. We'd be sacrificing something of more moral importance than we could gain for somebody else. All right, now certainly people have objections to this argument. Since it's a controversial conclusion, even though the premises lead to the conclusion and they're relatively uncontroversial, people lob objections at Singer here, and Singer considers some objections in his article. So let's take a look at those. So somebody might say, well, the suffering people, unlike in the thought experiment with the child in the pond who was right in front of you, the people who are suffering, the children who are suffering in this case, live very far away. We're lucky enough to live in a place where generally we don't see people starving to death. We don't see them usually dying from lack of medical care or shelter. That's we outsource these sorts of problems, and they exist in other places in the world to a much greater extent than they exist here. So somebody might say, well, look, there's a difference between the cases. The child's close by, the people suffering who I'd have to donate to, those are people who live far away. But Singer responds, it would be a weird moral view that would hold that I have more of an obligation to help those people who are physically closer to me than further away. There would be some very strange implications for that view. For example, if if the child was drowning and you just started walking away, the further you got away, the less of an obligation you would have to save them. That would be really weird. At which point would suddenly the worth of your $100 shoes be of greater moral importance than the child's life? It doesn't seem like at any point, right? As far as you'd walk away, if you could still help, then the distance shouldn't make a moral difference. The second objection he considers is, well, other people are not helping. And if other people did, then we wouldn't be obligated to give so much. And that's true. If everybody gave $5 to these causes, then we could solve, if not all of these issues, then a significant amount of them. So if everybody's not giving, then why does the obligation fall to us? A variation of this objection would be our government isn't doing what they can as far as donating to causes like famine relief. In fact, they're doing less in the last 2 years than they were doing before that. So if the government doesn't care, why should we care about it? Why? And if we donate to these causes, doesn't that make it so that the government is going to do less about it, right? So two variations of this objection. In response, Singer says, just because other people aren't giving, that might psychologically make us think that we are less obligated to do it, but really it has no effect on our obligation. If we accepted his argument that if we can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing something that has comparable moral significance, then we ought to do it. Well, it doesn't matter whether other people are doing it or not, and they're not, so these situations exist, so the obligation then falls to us. As far as the government not doing its part to help these situations, well, one response Singer could have is we should do more to make the government feel this obligation and do more about it. But the other thing he says is this: if government officials see that their citizens have little to no interest in helping people abroad, in helping people who are suffering to death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, then they would probably be less likely to take measures to prevent that suffering with public funds. So if we give, it's probably more likely to go the other way, that the government representatives or officials would see that people really care about this and would start running on those types of platforms. Third objection we'll take on here is Singer's proposal would demand drastic revision of many traditional moral views, and this undoubtedly is true. It's the normal view that giving to causes such as famine relief is charity, not obligation. Singer is trying to break down that distinction between charity and obligation, at least when it comes to our obligation to give to famine relief. So I think he just has to bite the bullet here and say, yes, it would demand a drastic revision of many traditional moral views, and say that even though that's true, it doesn't lead to the conclusion that his conclusion is wrong or that his argument's bad. He just has to explain why it would be better to go to drastically revise our traditional moral views than not. And we covered some responses to this objection in the chapter on utilitarianism. So utilitarian can say common sense has led us astray in the past. It's not a good guideline for our moral obligations. People can bring up examples of racism, sexism, slavery, colonialism, all sorts of examples where common sense of the day led people horribly astray. So maybe Singer's view is better off for not being a common sense traditional moral view. So another objection here is if we adopt Singer's views, we would all be working full time to relieve the great suffering of the innocent. And this should remind us of an objection in the chapter on utilitarianism, that, and this along with the last objection, that utilitarianism, or Singer's argument here, is too demanding, that we would have to people in fortunate circumstances in developed, wealthy nations such as the United States would have to sacrifice too much. We'd have to work full time. If we have to compare the moral significance of spending more of our time working versus the moral significance of children dying of famine, it seems that we should sacrifice our time to prevent the death of children suffering from those causes. And I think here that that Singer again has to bite this bullet. I think his view does lead to this conclusion, and again he would have to resort to the utilitarian defenses that just because something's common sense doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. Just because it's not common sense doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. If his argument goes through, it seems we would be obligated to take on more responsibility at work if we could make more money and donate more. So another objection, giving is what philosophers call supererogatory. It's not an obligation, it's charitable. So meaning anything supererogatory is something which it's good to do, but it's above and beyond the scope of our obligation. So above and beyond what we should be blamed for if we didn't do. So giving is supererogatory, not an obligation. Singer's trying to break down that distinction in this case. Finally, somebody might say, well, maybe giving money is not the best way to help. Maybe donating time is the best way to help. Maybe participating in programs like the Peace Corps or something like the Peace Corps would be the best way to help. Maybe if we just throw money at these problems, it won't really help anybody. That getting more involved on a personal level would be the best thing to do. Now, Singer, I take him to say by way of response that sometimes giving time is the best thing to do, especially if you're very knowledgeable about a problem, and if you don't have much money to donate. Then it seems in that circumstance that giving your time would be the best thing to do. But the problem is many of the people who are most in need are not very close by to us. So it's difficult to get that kind of working knowledge about the problems they face. And these charities that are listed on that GiveWell site, they have spent the hours of research and are working with people to try to solve these problems. So it seems that for most of us, giving money would be the best way to help. One other objection that he considers that I don't have listed here is maybe if we ultimately want to solve problems like the suffering that famine causes, we should, the root of all these problems is population control, that our population is growing to an unsustainable number, and we should focus our efforts on population control instead of famine relief. And Singer actually just bites that bullet too. He says if you think that's the cause of most of this suffering, then that's the cause you should be giving to. But there's still the comparable moral importance issue. So the suffering would still be greater than of greater moral importance than a luxury good that you might buy for yourself. So you'd be obligated to donate to those causes instead of, say, famine relief, if you think that that's the best way to solve these issues. All right, so that's the end of this argument, and we've considered many objections to his argument, and I think he has powerful responses to them. So if you are convinced by this argument, then you can look at sites like GiveWell.org and see what causes you can easily donate to, and which causes you'd be able to prevent the most suffering through your donations. Also, you can look up the movement that has come out of Singer's article, which is called Effective Altruism. And you can get more involved, get a newsletter to see what issues demand our attention immediately, what you can do with your life, how you can take action. And yeah, giving to outstanding charities, discuss and connect with other people who are interested. It has some fields you can fill in here, and you can talk about how much good you can do with other people and actually get out and do good in the world. And it has the added benefit of feeling good for yourself. Although note, Singer didn't really go into that in his argument. It feels good to donate to some of these charities and to do so effectively in a way that will definitely prevent suffering for people. So that's it for today. No quiz questions at the end of this video. I will post something on the discussion board, and we'll talk a little bit about this this argument. So thanks for sticking with this. I'll be back with another video about the essay assignment for this class, the optional essay assignment for this class, in the next video. All right, thanks.